In the heart of Adire, a kingdom of gold and secrets, a poor village girl named Dorothy was forced to marry a man of dust and toil, Samuel, a farmer with calloused hands and a quiet smile. But whispers followed them. A trickster's grin, a hidden box, a glint of something more. Guided by ancestral spirits, tested by a tree of truth and a river of fate, Dorothy uncovers a web of mystery. Is her husband a pauper or a prince? One revelation will change everything. From humble huts to hidden riches, this is a tale of trust, trickery, and the wisdom that shines brighter than gold. Will you unravel the secret? In the heart of a land kissed by the sun, where the earth hummed with the songs of ancestors, there stood the great kingdom of Adire. It was a city unlike any other, a place where towering mud-brick palaces gleamed with gold trim, and wide streets buzzed with traders shouting over the clatter of donkey carts. The air carried the scent of roasted yams, spiced with peppers and palm oil, mingling with the sweet perfume of shea butter sold in clay pots. Women in bright Ankara wrappers swayed as they balanced baskets of mangoes on their heads, while men in flowing Agbada robes bartered for cowrie shells and bolts of kente cloth. High above, the royal drummers beat their talking drums, sending messages of peace and prosperity across the rooftops. Adire was a kingdom of wealth and wonder, ruled by Oba Jelani, a king whose crown sparkled with beads of amber and whose laughter was said to make the rivers dance. But beyond the city's golden gates, in the shadow of its riches, lay the village of Oko, a humble cluster of thatched huts where the earth was red and cracked, and the people worked hard for every grain of millet they ate. In this village lived Dorothy, a girl with eyes like polished ebony and a spirit as fierce as the Harmattan wind. Her hands were rough from pounding yam, and her feet were dusty from fetching water at the river, but her heart was full of dreams. She was the youngest of 5 daughters, born to Mama Ngozi, a widow whose husband had joined the ancestors years ago after a fever took him in the night. Mama Ngozi was a woman of strength, her voice deep and steady like the roots of a baobab tree, but her shoulders sagged under the weight of feeding her family. Dorothy, Mama Ngozi would say, sitting by the fire as the stars blinked awake, the ancestors watch us always. They whisper wisdom in the wind and guide us through the shadows. Never forget their voices, for they know the paths we cannot see. Dorothy listened, her small hands clutching a wooden spoon as she stirred the agusi soup, the steam rising like spirits into the night. She loved these stories tales of brave warriors, clever animals, and the lessons woven into every leaf and stone. But life in Oko was not easy. The rains came late, the crops withered, and the village elders grumbled that the kingdom's wealth never trickled down to them. Dorothy's sisters had all married, some to farmers, some to traders, but none had brought riches home. Mama Ngozi's hope now rested on Dorothy, her last daughter, though Dorothy dreamed of more than a husband. She wanted to see the city of Adire, to walk its streets and hear the drums for herself. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with strokes of orange and pink, a stranger came to Oko. He was a wiry man with a grin that stretched too wide, his head wrapped in a faded turban. In his hand, he carried a staff topped with a spider carved from ebony. The children whispered his name, James, the trickster, the weaver of tales and tangles. He was no ordinary man, but a spirit who danced between worlds, delighting in mischief and secrets. Greetings, good people of Oko, James called, his voice sharp and musical. I bring news from the kingdom of Adire. Oba Jelani seeks a bride for a man of humble Minsa man, who tills the soil like you. A poor man, they say, but one who might rise with the right wife. Who among you has a daughter to offer? The villagers gathered, their murmurs rising like the buzz of bees. Mama Ngozi stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. What trick is this, James? You spin webs of words, but we know your ways. What man would the king care for in a place like this? James chuckled, tapping his staff on the ground. No trick, Mama Ngozi, only fate. The ancestors have spoken, and they point to Oko. Bring forth a girl, and she will marry this man. Refuse, and the rains may forget you entirely. His grin widened, showing teeth like polished stones. Mama Ngozi hesitated. She knew James's tongue was forked, but the threat of drought was real. The village could not survive another dry season. She turned to Dorothy, who stood by the hut, her bare feet planted in the dust. My daughter, she said softly, the ancestors guide us, even through tricksters. Will you go? Dorothy's heart thumped like a drum. She did not want a husband, not yet, and certainly not a poor man chosen by a spider's whim. But she saw the worry in her mother's eyes, the hunger in her neighbors' faces. If the ancestors will it, she said at last, her voice steady. I will go. The villagers cheered. Though some whispered that James's schemes never ended well, Mama Ngozi pulled Dorothy close, pressing a beaded bracelet into her hand. This was your father's, she said. Wear it, and let the ancestors walk with you. As the moon rose, pale and round, Dorothy packed a small bundle, her best wrapper, a comb carved from bone, and a handful of dried fish. James led her from Oko, his staff tapping a rhythm on the path. The journey to Adire was long, the road winding through fields of tall grass and groves of palm trees heavy with fruit. Frogs croaked in the distance, and the air grew thick with the scent of rain that never fell. At last, they reached the gates of Adire. The city sprawled before them, a tapestry of color and sound. Dorothy's breath caught as she saw the palace, its walls painted with stories of old elephants marching, warriors dancing, stars falling from the sky. Traders shouted, children laughed, and the drums sang a welcome that made her bones hum. Here, James said, pointing to a small compound near the market. Your husband awaits. The house was simple, its mud walls cracked, its roof thatched with palm fronds. A man stepped out, tall and lean, with hands calloused from work. His name was Samuel, and his eyes were kind but guarded, like a river hiding its depths. Dorothy stared at him, her heart sinking. He wore a patched tunic, and his sandals were worn thin. A poor man, just as James had said. She clutched her bracelet, whispering to the ancestors for strength. Little did she know, the trickster's web was only beginning to spin. Part 2. The Trickster's Whisper and the Forced Betrothal. The morning sun rose over Adire, spilling golden light across the city like honey over a warm loaf of bread. The streets came alive with the clatter of wooden looms weaving kente cloth, the chatter of women haggling over baskets of groundnuts, and the bleating of goats herded through the market. Dorothy stood outside Samuel's modest compound, her bare feet sinking into the cool earth, her heart a drumbeat of doubt. She clutched the beaded bracelet from her mother, its smooth stones warm against her skin, and whispered a prayer to the ancestors. Guide me, she said softly, for I do not know this path. Samuel emerged from the hut, his patched tunic swaying as he carried a hoe over his shoulder. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard work, and his hands were rough like the bark of an iroko tree. His eyes met hers, soft yet shadowed, as if they held secrets the sun could not reach. Welcome, Dorothy, he said, his voice low and steady. This is my home. It is not much, but it is yours now, too. Dorothy forced a smile, though her stomach twisted. She had hoped for more than a poor farmer's life dreams of Adire's golden streets, not a cracked mud hut. But she remembered Mama Ngozi's words. The ancestors know the paths we cannot see. She nodded and followed Samuel inside, where the air smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. A single mat lay on the floor, a clay pot sat in the corner, and a small stool wobbled under its own weight. It was a home of little, and Dorothy's dreams felt smaller still. Outside, James lingered, his spider staff tapping a restless rhythm. He watched Dorothy and Samuel with eyes that glinted like polished stones, a grin curling his lips. A fine match, he muttered to himself, but the web is not yet spun. With a flick of his turban, he slipped into the market crowd, his laughter trailing like a breeze. That afternoon, the village elders of Adire arrived at Samuel's compound, their robes dyed deep indigo and their staffs carved with symbols of old. They were led by Babatunde, a man whose beard was white as egret feathers and whose voice rumbled like distant thunder. James has spoken, Babatunde said, his gaze sweeping over Dorothy and Samuel. The king's decree is clear. A marriage must bind this house. The ancestors demand it, and the rains depend on it. Dorothy's breath caught. So soon? She asked, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. She had thought there would be time days to know this man, to weigh her fate, but Babatunde shook his head. The signs are in the sky. The clouds grow heavy, but they will not break until the knot is tied. Tomorrow, you wed. Samuel said nothing, his face a mask of calm. He nodded to the elders, his hands clasped behind his back. Dorothy wanted to protest, to run back to Oko and her mother's fire, but the weight of the village's need pressed on her shoulders. She thought of the cracked fields, the hungry children, the whispers of drought. If it is for the rains, she said at last, I will do it. The elders left, their footsteps fading into the hum of the city. Dorothy turned to Samuel, her eyes searching his. Do you want this? She asked. Or is it only James's game? Samuel hesitated, his fingers brushing the hose handle. I want what is right, he said simply. The ancestors will show us. His words were plain, but there was a flicker in his gazia spark Dorothy could not name. That night, As the moon hung like a silver calabash in the sky, Dorothy sat outside the hut, her wrapper pulled tight against the cool air. She heard a rustle in the shadows and looked up to see James perched on a low wall, his turban glowing faintly in the dark. "Troubled, little one?" he asked, his voice a teasing song. "You brought me here," Dorothy said, her tone sharp. "Why me? Why him?" James chuckled, spinning his staff between his fingers. "The ancestors love a good tale, and I am their weaver. You think Samuel is poor, a man of dirt and sweat. But webs have many threads, and not all shine at first glance. Trust the trickster, Dorothy, for I see what you do not." Dorothy frowned, her fingers tightening on her bracelet. "You speak in riddles. If there is more to Samuel, tell me plain." "Oh no," James said, leaping down with a flourish. "Where's the fun in that? Watch him, listen to him, and perhaps the ancestors will whisper the truth. Or perhaps I'll spin you into a bigger tangle yet." With a cackle, he vanished into the night, leaving only the echo of his laughter. Sleep came fitfully to Dorothy, her dreams filled with spiders weaving golden threads and rivers running dry. When dawn broke, the compound buzzed with preparations. Women from the market arrived, their arms laden with gift baskets of yams, jars of palm wine, and strings of cowrie shells. They sang as they worked, their voices rising like birds taking flight, praising the ancestors for the union to come. Dorothy's wrapper was traded for a new one, dyed crimson and gold, its edges stitched with tiny beads that clinked like raindrops. Her hair was braided with threads of yellow, and her wrists jingled with bangles of brass. Samuel, too, was transformed. His patched tunic was gone, replaced by a simple robe of white cotton, tied with a sash of green. He carried no hoe now, only a staff of polished wood, and his head was bare, his short hair catching the sunlight. He looked at Dorothy, and for a moment, his guarded eyes softened. "You are beautiful," he said, and the words hung between them like a fragile thread. The ceremony took place in the shadow of the palace, where a great baobab tree stretched its arms over a circle of stones. The drummers beat a rhythm that shook the earth, and the elders chanted blessings to the wind, the water, and the spirits of old. Baba Tunde poured libations of palm wine into the soil, calling on the ancestors to witness the bond. Dorothy and Samuel stood side by side, their hands tied with a strip of kente cloth, its colors bright against their skin. "Do you accept this path?" Babatunde asked Dorothy, his eyes piercing. She thought of Oko, of her mother's fire, of James's grin. "I do," she said, her voice steady though her heart raced. "And you, Samuel?" the elder asked. "I do," Samuel replied, his tone firm, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The crowd erupted in cheers, tossing petals of hibiscus into the air. The drums thundered, and the people danced, their feet stomping patterns into the dust. Dorothy felt the weight of the moment, the pull of something unseen. She glanced at Samuel, wondering what lay beneath his quiet words, his simple robe. James's riddle echoed in her mind. Not all threads shine at first glance. As the sun dipped low, painting the baobab's leaves with fire, the newlyweds returned to the compound. The women left gifts at the Dora clay, pot of stew, a woven mat, a small calabash of oil. Dorothy stepped inside, her new home, and turned to Samuel. "This is our life now," she said, testing the words. "Yes," he answered, setting his staff against the wall. "Our life." But as he spoke, he reached into a corner and pulled out a small wooden box, its surface carved with strange symbols. He opened it briefly, revealing a glint of something bright gold, perhaps. Before snapping it shut, Dorothy's eyes widened, but before she could ask, he smiled and said, "For another day." The trickster's web tightened, and the ancestors watched in silence. The days after the wedding stretched like a river winding through the dry season, slow, steady, and full of unseen currents. Dorothy woke each morning to the crow of roosters and the distant thrum of Adire's drums, her new life unfolding in the shadow of Samuel's modest hut. The air inside was thick with the scent of millet porridge bubbling over a small fire, and the walls echoed with the quiet rhythm of their shared silence. She swept the floor with a broom of palm fronds, fetched water from the well in a clay pot balanced on her head, and pounded yam with a pestle until her arms ached. It was the life of a poor man's wife, and yet something about Samuel tugged at the edges of her mind like a thread caught on a thorn. Samuel rose with the sun, his hoe slung over his shoulder as he left for the fields beyond the city gates. He returned at dusk, his tunic dusted with red earth, his hands stained with the labor of tilling soil. He spoke little, his words as sparse as rain in the harmattan, but his eyes held a warmth that softened the edges of Dorothy's doubt. "The crops will grow," he'd say, sitting by the fire as she served him a bowl of stew. "The ancestors bless the patient." Dorothy nodded, stirring the pot, but her thoughts drifted to the wooden box he'd opened on their wedding night. The glint of gold, the quick snap of the lid. What did he hide? One afternoon, as the sun blazed high and the market buzzed with the clink of cowrie shells, Dorothy sat outside the hut, mending a tear in Samuel's tunic. A shadow fell over her, and she looked up to see James, his turban tilted and his grin sharp as a blade. "How fares the bride?" he asked, twirling his spider staff. "Is married life all you dreamed?" Dorothy set the needle down, her eyes narrowing. "You wove this web, trickster. Samuel is kind but poor. If there's more to him, as you hinted, why do I see only dust and toil?" James laughed, a sound like pebbles tumbling down a hill. "Oh, Dorothy, you look with your eyes, not your heart. A spider hides its treasure in the corners, not the center. Watch your husband, little one." The thread unravels slowly. Before she could press him, he scampered off, his staff tapping a merry beat. That evening, Samuel returned earlier than usual, his hoe resting against the wall as he carried a small sack. "For you," he said, handing it to Dorothy. Inside were 2 ripe mangoes, their skins golden and fragrant, and a handful of groundnuts still warm from the sun. She smiled, surprised by the gift, but noticed his hands clean, not caked with soil as they should be after a day in the fields. "Where were you today?" she asked, peeling a mango with her knife. "The fields," he said simply, sitting on the stool. But his eyes flickered, and Dorothy felt the weight of James's words. She said nothing more, but the seed of curiosity took root. Days turned to weeks, and small strangenesses piled like stones in a riverbed. One morning, a trader from the Marquetta, stout man with a beard like a lion's, knocked at the door. "Samuel," he called, his voice booming. "The shipment is ready. When do you come?" Samuel stepped outside, his face calm, and spoke in low tones Dorothy couldn't hear. The trader left with a nod, and Samuel returned as if nothing had happened. "Who was that?" Dorothy asked, stirring a pot of okra soup. "A friend," Samuel said, his tone flat. "He trades grain." But the fields Samuel worked barely grew enough for their own potware. Was the grain for trade? Another day, as Dorothy washed their wrappers by the river, a group of children ran past, giggling and pointing at her. "Samuel's wife!" one shouted. "Does she know?" They scampered off before she could ask, their laughter echoing over the water. Dorothy frowned, her hands pausing in the suds. "Know what?" She glanced at her bracelet, whispering to the ancestors for clarity, but the river only gurgled in reply. The strangest moment came one night when the moon was a thin sickle in the sky. Dorothy woke to find Samuel gone from their mat. She slipped outside, the cool air brushing her skin, and saw him standing near the compound's edge, speaking to a figure cloaked in shadow. The stranger handed Samuel a pouch that jingled faintly, and Samuel tucked it into his tunic before returning. When he saw Dorothy, his face tightened. "Why are you awake?" he asked, his voice sharper than usual. "I heard something," she lied, watching him closely. "Who was that?" "A man who owed me a debt," Samuel said, brushing past her. "Go back to sleep." But the pouch was gone from his tunic, hidden somewhere in the dark. Dorothy's mind spun like a weaver's wheel. A poor farmer with no land to spare did not receive pouches of coins in the night. She thought of James's riddle-knot, all threads shine at first glance, and resolved to watch Samuel more closely. The ancestors, she hoped, would guide her to the truth. The next day, a storm brewed over Adire, the sky darkening with clouds that rumbled like the drums of war. Rain was rare in this season, and the people gathered in the streets, their voices rising in thanks to the ancestors. Dorothy stood with Samuel under the baobab tree, watching as the first drops fell, heavy and warm. The crowd cheered, but Samuel's face was still, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "The rains have come," Dorothy said, hoping to draw him out. "Your fields will thrive now." "Yes," he replied, but his hand rested on the wooden box he'd brought from the hut, its carvings catching the rain's gleam. Dorothy's pulse quickened. Why carry it now? As the storm passed, leaving the earth rich and red, a messenger arrived from the palace. He was a young man in a blue robe, his chest puffed with importance. "Samuel of Oko's line," he said, bowing slightly. "Obajilani summons you. Bring your wife." The crowd murmured, their eyes darting between Samuel and Dorothy. A poor farmer called to the king? It was unheard of. Samuel nodded, his expression unreadable. "We will go," he said, taking Dorothy's hand. His grip was firm, but his palm was smooth knot. the rough hand of a man who hoed fields day after day. Dorothy's heart thudded as they walked toward the palace, the golden gates looming like the jaws of fate. Inside, the throne room was a marvel of mud and gold, its walls painted with stories of warriors and spirits. Oba Jelani sat on a throne of carved ebony, his crown glinting with amber beads. His eyes were sharp, like a hawk's, and his voice rolled like thunder. "Samuel," he said, "the rains have blessed us, as the elders foretold. Your marriage has pleased the ancestors. But there is more to this tale, is there not?" Dorothy's breath hitched. She glanced at Samuel, expecting him to bow and mumble thanks. Instead, he stood tall, his shoulders squared. "Yes, my king," he said, his voice steady. "There is more, but the time is not yet right." The king laughed, a sound that shook the room. "A man of secrets? Very well, keep them for now. But the ancestors watch, and so do I." He waved them away, and Dorothy followed Samuel out, her mind a storm of questions. That night, as they sat by the fire, Dorothy could hold her tongue no longer. "Samuel," she said, her voice firm, "what do you hide? The box, the pouch, the king's words, tell me the truth." Samuel looked at her, his eyes deep and searching. For a moment, she thought he'd speak, but he only smiled, a small, quiet curve of his lips. "Trust me, Dorothy," he said. "The ancestors will show you when it's time." He rose and stepped outside, leaving her with the crackle of the fire and the weight of his words. In the shadows, James watched, his grin wide and knowing. The web was tightening, and the truth danced, just out of reach. The days after the palace summons hung heavy over Dorothy like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The rains had come, soaking the earth and turning the fields beyond Adire into patches of green, but her heart remained restless. Samuel's quiet smiles and guarded words wove a riddle she couldn't unravel, and the wooden box always near him, never open, sat like a silent judge between them. She clutched her beaded bracelet each night, whispering to the ancestors for answers, but their voices were as distant as the stars. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of fire, a strange wind swept through the compound. It rattled the thatched roof and sent dust swirling in tiny cyclones. Dorothy stepped outside, her wrapper flapping, and saw Samuel standing still, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice low. "Feel what?" she replied, but then she heard Ita hum, deep and ancient, rising from the earth itself. The air shimmered, and from the shadows emerged three figures, tall and cloaked in robes of mist. Their faces were hidden, but their presence filled the space like the weight of a mountain. Dorothy's breath caught. She knew them without knowing the ancestors had come. "Dorothy, daughter of Ngozi," one spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers. "Samuel, son of the hidden line. Your union was forged by fate, but it must be tested. The truth lies beyond the veil, and only the worthy may see it." Samuel bowed his head, his hands tightening on the wooden box. "We are ready," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. Dorothy's heart raced. She wanted to ask what this meant, but the ancestors raised their arms, and the world shifted. The compound vanished, replaced by a vast plain under a sky of endless twilight. The grass was tall and silver, swaying without wind, and in the distance stood a great tree, its branches heavy with glowing fruit. "Go to the tree of truth," the second ancestor said, its voice like water over stones. "Take only what you need, and leave what you do not. The path is yours to walk, but the trickster watches." Dorothy glanced at Samuel, who met her eyes with a nod. Together, they stepped forward, the grass brushing their legs like whispers. The air was thick with the scent of earth, and something sweeter honey, perhaps, or ripe mangoes. As they walked, a familiar cackle echoed behind them. James appeared, scampering alongside, his turban glinting in the strange light. "A fine test," he crowed. "Will you pass, or will I spin you deeper? Oh, I do love a good tangle." "Leave us, trickster," Dorothy snapped, her patience thin. "You've meddled enough." James grinned, twirling his staff. "Meddle? I only guide. The ancestors chose me to watch, and watch I will. But beware, the tree is not what it seems." With a wink, he darted ahead, vanishing into the grass. The journey was long, the plain stretching farther with each step. Shadows moved at the edges of Dorothy's vision, leopards with eyes of fire, birds with wings of smoke, but they did not approach. Samuel walked beside her, the box tucked under his arm, his face set like carved wood. "What do you think the tree holds?" Dorothy asked, breaking the silence. "Truth," he said simply, "and perhaps more." At last, they reached the tree of truth. It towered above them, its trunk wide as a hut, its branches laden with fruit that shimmered like gold. But as Dorothy looked closer, she saw the fruit was not fruit at all. Some were coins, others jewels, and a few were simple stones polished to a gleam. The ground beneath was littered with treasures, cowrie shells, bolts of kente cloth, calabashes filled with oil. A voice whispered from the tree, soft as a breeze, "Take what you need, leave what you do not." Dorothy hesitated. She thought of Oko, of her mother's hunger, of the cracked fields. She reached for a handful of coins, their weight cool in her palm. "This could feed my village," she said, her voice firm. But the tree trembled, and the coins grew hot, burning her skin. She dropped them with a cry, and they sank into the earth. Samuel watched, his eyes steady. "Need, not want," he murmured, stepping forward. He set the wooden box at the tree's roots and opened it. Inside lay a single seed, small and brown, nestled in a bed of gold dust. He took the seed, leaving the dust behind, and the tree sighed, its branches stilling. Dorothy frowned. "A seed? What good is that?" "Trust," Samuel said, closing the box. "The ancestors know." Before she could argue, the plain shimmered again, and they stood before a river, its waters black and swift. A narrow bridge of vines stretched across, swaying in the wind. The ancestors' voices returned, "Cross together, or not at all." James reappeared, perched on the bridge's edge. "A tricky one," he sang. "One step wrong and splash. The river keeps its secrets well." He tapped his staff, and the vines quivered. Dorothy tested the bridge with her foot. It creaked, barely holding her weight. "We can't both cross at once," she said. "It'll break." Samuel shook his head. "Together," they said. "Hold my hand." He offered it, his grip firm, and Dorothy took it, her heart pounding. They stepped onto the bridge, the vines groaning under their combined weight. Halfway across, a gust of wind rocked them, and Dorothy stumbled, her foot slipping through a gap. She gasped, clinging to Samuel, who pulled her back with a strength she hadn't known he had. "Steady," he said, his voice calm. "We're almost there." Step by step they crossed, the river roaring below, until they reached the other side. The bridge vanished behind them, and James clapped, his grin wide. "Well done, but the last test waits." The plain shifted once more, and they stood in a circle of stones, each carved with symbols of old sun, moon, river, flame. The ancestors appeared, their misty forms glowing brighter. "One final choice," the third said, its voice deep as the earth. "Give what you hold, or keep it for yourselves." Dorothy looked at Samuel, who held the seed in his palm. She had nothing, no coins, no jewels, only her bracelet. "What do we give?" she asked. Samuel knelt, digging a small hole in the soil with his fingers. He placed the seed inside and covered it, then stood. "This," he said. "It's enough." Dorothy hesitated, her hand brushing her bracelet. It was her father's, her mother's gift, her link to Oko. But she thought of the tree's lesson need, not wantoned unclasped it, laying it beside the seed. "For the ancestors," she whispered. The ground trembled, and a sprout pushed through the soil, growing swiftly into a sapling with leaves of green and gold. The ancestors nodded, their voices blending into one. "You have chosen well. Truth is yours, but wisdom must guide it." The plain faded, and Dorothy and Samuel stood again, in their compound, the night sky above them clear and bright. Dorothy turned to Samuel, her eyes wide. "What was that seed? What did we pass?" Samuel smiled, a true smile that lit his face. "A beginning," he said. "The ancestors tested us greed against trust, self against others. We chose the harder path." "But your secret," she pressed, her voice sharp. "The box, the gold, the king, what are you?" Samuel's smile faded, and he looked at her with eyes deep as the river they'd crossed. "Tomorrow," he said. "The ancestors have spoken, and tomorrow you'll know." James's laughter rang from the shadows, faint but clear. "Oh, what a tale," he called. "The web is nearly spun, and the gold shines at last." He vanished, leaving Dorothy with a heart full of questions and a night full of stars. The night after the ancestors' test passed like a dream, leaving Dorothy restless and awake as dawn crept over Adire. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint hum of the city stirring to life. She sat outside the hut, her fingers tracing the empty space where her bracelet once rested, her mind a whirl of questions. Samuel had promised the truth today, and the weight of that promise hung heavy, like a storm about to break. Samuel emerged from the hut, his white robe crisp against the morning light, the wooden box tucked under his arm. His face was calm, but his eyes held a spark Dorothy hadn't seen before, a fire ready to blaze. "Come," he said, offering his hand. "It's time." She took it, her pulse quickening, and they walked through the waking streets of Adare. The market was alive with color women in bright wrappers hawking baskets of yams, men shouting over piles of kente cloth, children darting between stalls with laughter. The drums beat a steady rhythm, calling the day to order, and the golden gates of the palace gleamed ahead. But Samuel turned away from the palace, leading her instead to a narrow path behind the market, where the noise faded and the air grew still. They stopped at a compound Dorothy had never seen, its walls high and smooth, painted with swirling patterns of red and gold. A heavy wooden gate stood closed, guarded by two men in green tunics, their staffs topped with carved eagles. They bowed to Samuel, their eyes respectful, and swung the gate open without a word. Dorothy's breath caught as they stepped inside. The courtyard was a marvel. Palm trees swayed over a tiled floor, their fronds casting dappled shadows. A fountain bubbled in the center, its water clear as glass, and around it stood stacks of good sacks of grain, bolts of silk, jars of oil sealed with wax. Beyond the courtyard rose a house, its mud brick walls tall and strong, its roof tiled with clay that shone in the sun. Servants moved quietly, carrying trays of fruit and bundles of firewood, their heads dipping as Samuel passed. Dorothy stopped, her feet rooted to the tiles. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Samuel turned to her, his smile soft but wide. "My home," he said, "my true home." Before she could speak, a familiar cackle rang out. James scampered from behind a palm tree, his turban askew, his staff spinning. "Surprise!" he crowed. "The web is spun, the gold revealed. Did I not tell you, Dorothy? Not all threads shine at first glance." Dorothy's eyes darted from James to Samuel, her heart pounding. "You're no farmer," she said, stepping back. "Who are you?" Samuel set the wooden box on the fountain's edge and opened it. Inside, nestled in the gold dust, was a ringa band of silver set, with a single amber stone, glowing like a captured sun. He took it out and held it up. "I am Samuel Jelani," he said, his voice steady. "Son of Oba Jelani's brother, heir to a fortune hidden from the world. This ring is my birthright. But I chose to live as a poor manto, learn the soil, the sweat, the truth of life." Dorothy's knees weakened. She sank onto the fountain's rim, her wrapper pooling around her. "A millionaire," she murmured. "All this time, gold, grain, this house and you, let me think you were nothing." Samuel knelt before her, his eyes meeting hers. "I wanted a wife who saw me, not my wealth. The king knew, the elders knew, but I swore them to silence. James brought you to me, and the ancestors tested us. You chose trust over greed, Dorothy. You gave your bracelet when you had nothing else. That's why I can tell you now." James clapped, his grin stretching wide. "A fine tale. The poor village girl weds a secret prince, and the trickster ties the knot. Oh, the ancestors will sing this one for years." Dorothy's mind spun. She thought of the cracked hut, the patched tunic, the nights by the fire. "Why hide it?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Why make me toil when you had all this?" Samuel's face softened. "Wealth is a mask, Dorothy. It blinds those who wear it and those who chase it. I saw my father drown in gold, losing his heart to its shine. I vowed to know the world without Ido, find a life built on more than coins. When James came to Oko, I asked him to find me a bride who'd see the man, not the fortune." Dorothy glanced at James, who winked. "And you chose me," she said, her tone flat. "A poor girl to match your disguise." "No," Samuel said, taking her hand. "A strong girl, a wise girl, one who'd walk the ancestors' path with me." The courtyard grew quiet, the servants pausing, the fountains trickle loud in the silence. Dorothy pulled her hand back, her chest tight. She thought of Mama Ngozi, of Oko's hunger, of the dreams she'd buried. "You could have helped us," she said. "The village starves while you play this game." Samuel nodded, his eyes steady. "I will help. The seed we planted, it's a promise. Fields will grow, Oko will thrive. But I needed you to know me first, not my gold." Dorothy stood, her wrapper rustling, and walked to the edge of the courtyard. She looked out at the city, its golden roofs. Its bustling streets, and felt the weight of her journey. The ancestors had tested her, James had tricked her, and Samuel had hidden from her. Yet she'd crossed the river, given her bracelet, chosen trust. Was that enough? A soft breeze stirred the air, carrying a whisper, her mother's voice, faint but clear. "The ancestors know the paths we cannot see." Dorothy turned back to Samuel, her eyes fierce. "You should have told me sooner," she said. But I see you now, not the gold, not the king's blood, but the man who crossed the bridge with me. If this is our path, I'll walk it. But no more secrets. Samuel rose, the ring still in his hand. No more, he promised. He slipped the ring onto her finger, its amber catching the light, and the courtyard erupted in cheers from the servants, who'd gathered to watch. James danced, his staff twirling, his laughter ringing like bells. That evening, Oba Jelani arrived, his crown glinting as he embraced Samuel and Dorothy. A fine match, he boomed. The rains came, the ancestors smiled. And my nephew's heart is true. Adire is richer for it. He gifted them a herd of goats and a chest of cowrie shells. But Dorothy's eyes stayed on Samuel, the man she'd married in dust and found in gold. Weeks later, Dorothy returned to Oko with Samuel at her side. The seed from the ancestors' test had sprouted in Adire's fields, and wagons of grain followed them, enough to fill every hut. Mama Ngozi wept as she hugged her daughter, her hands tracing the amber ring. The ancestors guided you, she said, her voice thick, and you listened. Dorothy smiled, her heart full. She'd been a poor village girl, forced into a marriage she didn't want, but she'd found more than wealth a husband who valued her, a lesson in trust, and a life woven by fate's clever hands. James, perched on a nearby roof, tipped his turban. A moral for the ages, he called. Gold buys bread, but wisdom feeds the soul. And so, the tale of Dorothy and Samuel spread through Adire and beyond, sung by griots under baobab trees, a story of trickery, truth, and the quiet power of a heart that sees beyond the shine.